Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is a J-Man Time, and today I have a video on the most forgotten British tank used in the Second World War. And this is a tank that was largely used during the fighting in North Africa, in particular the fighting around Egypt and in eastern Libya, between the British and Italian forces between 1939 and 1941, at least for this tank. And this tank here is one of the rarest British tanks developed during the Interwar era, and that tank is the Vickers Medium Mark II from 1925. The Medium Mark II was an upgrade to the Vickers Medium Mark I tank, also developed in the early 1920s. The Mark II was developed in 1925 and produced until about 1930. The vehicle was armed with a 47mm 3-pounder Ordnance 3-pounder quickfire gun, which had a armor penetration of 25 to 35 millimeters at 500 to 1,000 yards. The secondary armament was 5.303 caliber Vickers machine gun. The armor thickness was very thin at about 6.25 millimeters to 8 millimeters, meaning this tank had very thin armor when compared to other medium tanks used during the Second World War. In fact, this medium tank had the armor thickness of a light tank. The speed of the vehicle was 13 miles per hour or 21 kilometers per hour, so making this medium tank not very fast when compared to other World War II era tanks. This vehicle had a crew of 4 to 5, and 167 of these vehicles were produced between 1925 and about 1930 and 1931. Now, these tanks were also used by both the British Army and they were also used by British colonial forces, mostly in Egypt. These tanks were largely used to train British tank crews during the interwar years before many of them were phased out between 1936 and 1938 in favor of newer British medium and light tanks. Only the tanks that were stationed on the British mainland were phased out. Most of these tanks were still in limited use in areas of the British Empire, mostly in Egypt. In Egypt, they were part of Major General Sir Percy Hobart's 7th Armored Division based in Egypt. Later on, in 1940, the Italians would join the Axis powers and declare war on Great Britain and would invade British territories in North Africa. Egypt was one of the targets that was later invaded by General Graziani's armored divisions later on in late 1940. During this time period, General Percy Hobart had to scramble together any tanks and vehicles he had left in Egypt in order to counter the Italian invasion. As a result, he had several of these Vickers Mark II medium tanks in storage in Egypt. These tanks were pressed back into service and were used to counter the Italian tanks that were invading Egypt. Most of the Italian tanks had very thin armor, especially the tankettes, tanks like the Fiat M1139 and Fiat M1440, and they also had some Italian tankettes like the Italian L333, L335, and L338 series of tankettes, all of which had very thin armor. The 47mm gun of this tank could pierce the armor of just about any and all Italian vehicles being used during the Italian invasion of Egypt. Later on in the same year, the British would push the Italians out of Egypt into Libya. Later on, the Italians would call for reinforcements, mainly from the Germans, and later Germany would send one of their best generals, Erwin Rommel, to North Africa, and he would also bring some of his panzer divisions from the Ghost Division. This was Rommel's unit that was used to conquer France early on in 1940. During the fighting in Libya, these Vickers medium Mark II tanks went up against German Panzer III and IV tanks, and even some German light tanks like the Panzer I and II. Sir Percy Hobart only had a small number of these tanks in service, and it is unknown how well they did against the German and Italian tanks, although I could guess they did very well, as there are some footage of these tanks advancing on Italian and German positions as late as 1941. The Vickers medium Mark II tanks were also used in Iraq during the Anglo-Iraqi War. In 1941, Britain invaded Iraq after a border skirmish between the Iraqi forces and British forces in the area of Hibernia. During this event, the Iraqi military tried to take over the British military base at Hibernia, and as a result, Britain declared war on Iraq, which was neutral at the time. During this invasion, the British used about 3 or 4 of their Vickers medium Mark II tanks. These were Vickers medium Mark II tanks that were based in the British-held portion of Iraq. After the fall of Iraq, these tanks were also used during the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. Later on in 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union would invade and annex Iran in order to take over the Iranian oil fields, and these tanks also served on that front line. After 1941, these tanks were later phased out in favor of newer British and later American tanks as the U.S. would enter the fighting in North Africa later on in 1942. What happened to the remaining tanks in North Africa is unknown, but they were probably scrapped. Some Vickers medium Mark II tanks and some Vickers medium Mark I tanks were also used by the British Home Guard in 1940 through 1944, as the Home Guard had very few tanks and most of the newer tanks were being sent to the front line, so only older tanks and experimental tanks were being pressed into service with the British Home Guard. The Home Guard was sort of a mixture of civilian and military militias that were put together by the British government or by local volunteer groups in order to defend Britain in case Germany were to invade Britain at any point between 1940 and 1944. As Germany and Italy began to lose the war, the Home Guard really didn't need tanks anymore, and most of the Vickers medium Mark I and medium Mark II tanks were decommissioned again, with the last tank being decommissioned in 1944. The Vickers medium Mark II is one of the rare British medium tanks used in World War II. It is still one of those British tanks that was still very useful in the Second World War. If the British had continued mass producing these tanks, they could have served on other front lines too. For example, in the Pacific. During the fighting in the Pacific, the British would lose many of their colonial territories, mostly Singapore and Malaya. Just imagine how the war could have went in that region if the British had exported some of their Vickers medium Mark II tanks to Singapore and Malaya, and maybe some of the other British territories. The 47mm gun of the Vickers Mark II could defeat the armor of just about any Japanese tank, as most Japanese tanks like the Type 95 Hago and Type 97 only had an armor thickness of 12 to 25mm, which the Vickers medium Mark II's 47mm gun could penetrate. The only downside was the armor thickness of just 6 to 8mm. But the tank still could have had some use in the Pacific. The tank could have been exported to China. The Chinese were already purchasing British light tanks and tankettes, so I guess the British could have exported some of their Vickers medium Mark I and II tanks to China to fight against the Japanese, and maybe even the Chinese Red Forces during the Chinese Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War against both Mao Zedong and later on the Imperial Japanese forces. But those are just would've, could've, should'ves. At least the Vickers medium Mark II did have some service in World War II, as most of the other interwar experimental British tanks didn't really see any use at all outside of the Home Guard. So what do you think of this rare history of the British medium Mark II tank? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.